All right. Good morning, folks. I think we should be good to get started. Hop right into it. So the first item on the agenda, this is something we discussed, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's the proposal for prioritized leader election. So basically, for those of you who aren't aware, we want the default revision to handle all of the things that are guarded by leader election, basically. And we talked about this, and basically, I wanted to go back and change a few things about the proposal, but in the end, actually, it stayed basically the same. The main discrepancy last time was whether we needed to change the actual Kubernetes leader election library that we rely on to make this happen. And I'm pretty convinced that we actually do after working on it for since the last meeting. So yeah, the proposal is pretty much in good shape. If we could get formal approval on it, that would be great. And we also have a PR that's up and ready for review. So yeah, it's kind of request for comments, request for feedback on that. Is there any thoughts on that since last time, or are we all thinking that looks reasonable?
I think it's okay. I mean, yeah, go ahead, Lynn.
Sorry, I was just going to say, can you quickly take us through the user experience for this?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So from like a few months back, we made it so that the Istio control tag command controls which revision handles validation. So you want to change the default revision. So you do Istio control tag set default revision, whatever. And then it handles validation. So the only change now is that when you do that same thing to change the default, it will also make it so that it handles like ingress status controller updates and gateway status controller updates and all of the things that only one revision should be responsible for. And it'll just happen automatically. So it's kind of cool. Like if you change the revision with Istio control tag set default, you can look in the logs and see that the controllers on the previous default kind of wind down, and the controllers on the new default, spin up and start doing their thing. So it's pretty much the same UI.
Yeah, from a user perspective, it's basically things will work as expected in the sense that the controllers that matter, I mean, ingress controller upgrade and so forth, will be controlled by the default revision, which is what you would expect. If you do a Canary upgrade, you don't want Canary to suddenly start picking up those core functionality. So it's more a bug fix for random workload picking up the critical work.
Yeah, makes sense. I guess I would expect that that's already implemented today. Thanks.
Unfortunately not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Costin, John, Jacob yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I ship it. I like it.
Can I put you down as approver there?
Yeah.
Put me there as well. I'm trying to edit. Yep.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Awesome. Yeah, I think that's everything on that proposal then. So
let's move to a more controversial one.
Yeah.
Hey, Sam, just very quickly, is there anything that would have to change for Helm if Helm's using default revision labels?
Yeah, see, that's a good point. It should just use this. So basically the way it works is it'll just look for the default tag mutating webhooks. So however you get that set,
okay,
with Helm. So however you want to do it, however we decide that the best way to change the default with Helm is, that'll just work with the default later election. And also it works well with older revisions, and it works well when there is no default as well. so it won't block one of. So if you have 3 revisions, none of them are default for some reason. It'll still pick one of them. One of them will still win the leader election. So nothing
okay.
breaks. Yeah.
Okay.
Sam, one thing I want to add to this proposal, if possible. We discussed last time. It is possible to run Istio without injection, as we discussed, and it's a proposal. Would be great if the istio-cattle tag command will create a config map where all the tags, and I mean, it can be a simple hash map where the config maps are updated, and we do not depend directly on the mutating webhook, which may not exist.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that.
It's not a P0. We can do it in 1.13. It's not really critical, but we definitely need to track it because it's, there are cases where users for security reasons do not want to have mutating webhooks. And if they use kube inject or other things, it's perfectly legit use case.
Yes. So a little while ago, I tried to put the revision tags in base, and then the next step there would have been generating a config map from that map of revision tags, but I think we kind of need to go back to the drawing board on how we want to configure that, because
a config map, I mean, if we go, if the injection list is approved, the core proposal there is to have a config map, flat config map with, internal non-API stuff. I mean, basically key values that are equivalent to the environment variables that are not user visible, and that's a perfect place to put this because that's internal between istio-cattle set the tag and the istiod.
okay, yeah, that
It
makes
will also
sense.
help. It will also help selection when you have the injection list will use this to select the control plane because it doesn't have mutating webhook.
Yeah, we were kind of looking for a place to like put the canonical mapping, so maybe that's a perfect fit.
Yeah, we call it mesh env because it's also supposed to be a bit more independent to what mesh it is. I mean, it can be Istio, it can be other people who are using other meshes, and basically to have a consistent way for auto configuration. Okay, let's take it offline if you want. I think we are in agreement mostly.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so the next item. Yeah, so this is with respect to the Proxy Config Crd. So last time I think we discussed it as a working group together. We kind of settled that we wanted, if you have a Proxy Config Crd present, it should just replace whatever is set in the annotation and in the existing mesh config, proxy config stuff. So this is an ongoing discussion in the PR for the API change, is that maybe we shouldn't do just a straight up replace, and we should do some kind of a smarter merge strategy here, which I think I agree with, and that raises some other questions. So yeah.
But remember the reason there was a reason we decided we choose to have proxy config take over, and that was RBAC and security. And I don't think we have any approach that will address this if we merge, because the idea was that if people start adopting proxy configs, they can set RBAC, and only the admin can decide all the things that go in proxy config, like with all other CRDs. But if a user has pod permissions can override, then we kind of lose this.
How can
Plus, we have complexity.
So just to clarify, you're saying that I am in untrusted namespace and I can create a pod, but I cannot control my own proxy config?
That's perfectly legit. I mean, it's perfectly possible in your namespace to be able to create pods with admission webhook or whatever, and not be able to create security policies, not be able to change routing, for example, because the security admin is in charge of this.
I would agree that you could lock down those configs, but proxy config is this is a convenient CRD to configure the pod. If they can configure the pod, they could already do it manually. They don't need this API, right?
If we move, I mean, there are plans to move the control, the proxy out of the pod. So it's that in CNI or whatever. I think there are all kind of efforts to do this. If that is the case, then the pod will be completely powerless to mess with security or with other things. So the admin can enforce that, it cannot be bypassed basically.
I don't see how you can enforce anything on the pod because I could always go and manually run pilot agent and envoy and put whatever config I want.
Yeah, no, but if we use CNI, and you don't have network permissions, then IP table will be enabled. You cannot mess with it. You cannot do
Yeah.
anything about it. And then if the envoy is running outside of the pod,
Oh,
either
sure.
part of
If
CNI,
we do that eventually.
and
yeah.
we are working on this. I mean, this is we are talking about efforts that are already approved and on you know.
Yeah, I would assume we don't. If we do that though, then we don't read the pod annotations.
We could do
So-
that as well, but why would you take the complexity and to merge and then to explain user, wait a minute, if you run in a mesh that is enforced, where security is enforced, then the pod annotations though are not merged, but otherwise they are merged. And I mean, what benefits do we get on?
Well, I don't think the setup that you described is going to be ready in like at least a year, which is part of my rationale there. But I think that it's not great migration behavior if one user creates proxy config at the global level and suddenly all the annotations stop working.
No. I don't think that was the plan. I mean, there are separate issues. I mean, the global level is taking over the mesh config proxy, the default, and the namespace level is taking over the annotation for the pod. So it's not.
Okay.
So
I think
the
whatever we
independent.
do, we clearly need to describe what exactly
Yeah.
the order is because it's pretty complicated no matter what we do. Where there's at least a lot of different ways we could do it, and it's not obvious which one it is, so we should say which one.
But adding to this complexity on top the merging, I think it's even worse because we have annotation, we have the mesh config default, we have the new CRD.
So just to be clear, we're in agreement that the proxy config CRDs themselves should merge on top of each other on the namespace level, the workload selector level, and the global level, right? That's a given in the API.
Is it? Yes, probably. Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah, why not?
Yeah,
That's all
that's
the other
right.
resource was,
Yeah,
right?
that's how
It's
everything
like-
else. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
okay. So if that's sorted out, I think I agree with the migration concerns. I think it would be nice if users could migrate to the proxy config CRD like one field at a time. And also a ton of stuff isn't configurable through here. So I think merging makes the most sense to me, even with the existing annotation and mesh config stuff.
But I mean, the migration is very simple. In a namespace, if you want to move to proxy config, you start using proxy config. What exactly is a migration? I mean, it's we are not in a hurry for them to move. I mean, if they keep using the annotations, they're perfectly fine. It's not, there is no reason for them to move if they don't want to.
Well, the migration challenge is a conflict. What if there's a conflict, right, between the customer resource in that namespace or customer resource that's selecting the workload, and what if they are different from the annotation? So which one is going to win? And their workload might be broken, right? Because you might be selecting a proxy config that's not what user wanted, or the admin maybe selected something that's conflict and it could have broke the service.
But then it's very simple. If you use annotation, you keep using annotation. We are not removing it. There is no problem with that. So if you have a pod that is using annotations, there is absolutely no incentive to add a proxy config. If you start fresh with a new pod, then you just start using proxy config. That's the easiest for everyone. They don't have to worry about what overrides what and ordering. It's super intuitive.
Well,
Use one or the other.
We're just promoting a tiny subset of what is configurable through the annotation. So if we just completely, if the logic is like, if there's a proxy config annotation in the namespace, just totally ignore the annotation. Sorry, if there's a proxy config CRD, just totally ignore the annotation. Then how can the user
Okay, how
specify
about
those fields that aren't promoted yet?
How about if the annotation is present, we have a flag that controls. I mean, like we did with other things. If annotation is present, we keep using it. Otherwise, we use proxy config. Then we don't break anyone.
So if the annotation is present, we ignore the proxy config CRD if it exists, or if we
Yeah,
don't
I mean,
ignore
if the
it, then we have
user
to define a merge policy.
My concern is that merge policies are very hard to understand for users. I mean, even for us. I mean, what fields take priority? What happens if a default? How do you override? It's a mess. The more we can avoid it, the better it is for everyone.
Yeah, I like it. I mean, basically, annotation wins to
We-
for backwards compatible.
With a flag somewhere, because if we start in force mode with non-bypassable proxies and other things, then we want the annotations to be kind of strict mode versus permissive. In permissive, you can override with annotations. In strict mode, we use only CRDs.
Yeah, that's fine, but they have to explicitly enable that. So
Yep.
it's not something it will be shipped by default.
Yeah, I suppose they will have CNIs. They will have. I mean, if they want to run in strict mode, they will have a very special setup anyway.
Yep. That seems
John.
reasonable. That's John.
I think it could be reasonable. One thing I want to make sure that we do support though is like right now with the external control plane, you have to configure a bunch of stuff like addresses and root certs and whatever. We should be able to set that at the top level and then not let the lower levels override it.
Yep.
Yeah, that's an important use case to preserve. As long as we have that, then I care. I'm not too picky about the other options.
Did we? I think Rob or someone had concerns about discovery address, and the proposal was to not have discovery address in the CRD.
It is not there, but CA address is an environment variable, and that's in this. So.
Oh, CA address and
root certs and all the other stuff like that.
Yeah, but all the environment variables are not intended to be API really. I mean, they're just.
Yeah, but they are in this API.
No. I mean, the API has ability to specify environment variables, but CA address is not really a beta API. It's an internal. We could add it to mesh. I don't know. That's an interesting point. But orthogonal. I agree with you. We need to have a way to specify what can be special fields, basically.
Yeah, like we need to support the existing use case that we have today with external Istio.
Yep, I agree. But that's implementation. I mean, part of the implementation, we can override some things and inject some other stuff. But that way, we try to keep the API surface small.
Okay, so basically, as part of the API, we should document, at least for this first iteration, that all of the variables that we need to set as part of the setup for external STOD, those are not going to be overrideable. And that's kind of part of the smart merge. I think that's very reasonable.
Look, if you want to override, I'm fine. I mean, I was just trying to avoid complexity. But if you want to merge, I think it's not the end of the world. We have worse things in.
One thing that's still not clear to me. So I see that if there's an annotation existing, then we just don't look at the CRD. That makes sense for backwards compatibility. So is it going to be the same idea for the top level mesh config default config? Like if anything is set there, then we totally ignore the global proxy config CRD?
That's a more interesting one because the global one is also interacts with what John described, with external STOD and other things where I don't know. Can we start in 112, just add the CRD, add a simple case where if you have the CRD, it is used. And then in 113, based on feedback and experience, we can deal with more complicated cases.
I agree, but these are blockers for the API merging.
Well, the API merge can just ignore or can just say that if annotation is present, we just use it. So because that's a simple case. It's basically if you're in a clean system that where you're using only proxy config, then you have the API behavior well deterministic and clear. If you are legacy, then we just opt for backward compatibility.
Okay, yeah, I agree on the annotation. So I guess also for the global stuff for mesh config, we should just
Yeah,
ignore the CRD.
that can work as well.
Okay.
Yeah, that can work as well. So you can either have a clean system or you only use beta APIs and then CRDs and everything else, or if you have the dirty systems, then we opt for stability and backward compatibility. And refine it in future versions. I mean, it's not really. What is the plan for telemetry? I mean, John, do you know what they did? I mean, if they have the new CRDs and the old mesh config, which one takes priority?
Let me see. I think just the new one takes priority.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. But then we have the risk of upgrade, because if you have an upgrade and well, probably not. Okay.
But there is different because this thing is used also on the pod level, so it's a little bit more complicated.
The telemetry one could be set at the pod level as well because it was in proxy config. But they just have the API take precedence over everything.
I see. Interesting.
Yeah.
So now what we discussed is opposite of what they're doing.
Exactly.
The one difference, I would agree, we probably should align with what they did. And you should double check what I said. I'm not certain that's the case. But the one difference here is that in telemetry, there's no need for like the control plane having a hard override. Whereas here, I think we do need that. If people don't have any clue what I'm talking about, in external Istio, what we're doing is like, it doesn't make sense for the user to control things like discovery address or the root certificate for XDS or a few other fields, because that's like the control plane's decision. And so those are kind of hard coded at the control plane level, whereas other settings, can be configured by the user. So I think that's important to keep.
John, it's not entirely clear. I mean, that it's a strict requirement that they cannot be overridden. I mean, the requirement is that if you create a pod, it will work as expected. But if you explicitly set discovery address to something else, as you said, I mean, you can just not inject or do other things to bypass.
Yeah, so I would say that it is a requirement that if a user goes and sets, I want proxy metadata foo equals bar, it doesn't wipe out all the other proxy metadata.
Not all, but if they want to specify CI address equal foo because they don't want to use whatever the external Istio settings, then
yeah, if that part I'd be fine with, as long as I think it's a hard requirement that you don't wipe out everything accidentally.
Absolutely.
If you explicitly override it, then I could go either way.
Yep, I agree. Okay, Sam, do you think we confused you more than you were at the beginning of the meeting?
I think it mostly makes sense. I think Mandar actually, from his comment, he kind of brought up the telemetry API as the case that, like they're already doing a merge that protects certain keys that shouldn't be messed with. So I have no idea what the telemetry API needs protected there. But how are we disaligned with them? I'm not 100% clear there, because I thought this change to make it a smart merge that protects certain keys at the top level was aligned with the telemetry API.
It's not clear what keys we need to protect. I mean, it's John was saying that if you set environments, we should not just replace the entire dictionary, but
right.
Let's dig more into what they are doing. But I think we don't have to do the smart merge. It's just a problem for upgrades, really. I don't know.
Okay, I can also reach out more to Mandar and get some clarification on what the telemetry API is doing, and just make sure this isn't totally going to confuse people.
What are we doing with the security CRDs? Are they having some of the same concerns? Is anybody aware of? Because I know they're starting to make those, right? Or wasn't there an effort to kind of make a more robust CRD for I think certificates? I wasn't sure.
There are all kind of efforts, and for security, there is also the issue of the new gateway APIs and delegation, which has a very yet another way to control attachment and. But security doesn't use annotation too much.
Okay, the reason why I'm bringing this up is I'm wondering if there's more of, some kind of directive that, all teams can be kind of working through so that we make sure we kind of, aren't doing something a little bit differently from each other. So then, users have a different experience from, one layer, to another. So.
Yeah, I agree. The common experience is to use CRD. I mean, virtual service is what controls virtual service. So the discussion here is how you migrate from the current status with annotations to the desired status with CRDs, where everything is consistent. I completely agree with you. We want to be consistent with the rest of Istio.
I think Sven made a comment on the PR that we kind of redocument for basically every CRD the same structure of precedence and hierarchy with global resource, namespace resource, workload selectors. And maybe we should have a central place that this is the Istio configuration model. Maybe some CRDs behave slightly differently, but, look at this really good guide instead of all of the one-off.
But annotations are the ones that we're supposed to deprecate at some point and kind of move people to the consistent one. So how about the CRD as defined is following exactly what Sven said and what we discussed, with no mention of annotation except one, either if an annotation is present, then it's going to take over or whatever. I mean, but not do merging, because that's not part of the general Istio strategy, because they don't have annotation except this one. That's a one-off, basically.
So yeah, that makes sense. So we'd also, if we wanted people to be able to adopt this, then we'd have to, in our docs, everywhere we use default config, change that so that it uses the proxy config CRD.
Yep.
Or else okay, that makes sense too. One thing, I was actually looking through some implementation stuff, and one thing that confused me was the presence of a proxy config discovery service. And it looks like it only functions with certificate, like some value with certificates. I don't think I have the context on that. Does anybody know what that is?
I think the agreement was to remove discovery address from proxy config for now.
No, sorry. There's like a proxy config discovery service that makes it so that you can change some values in proxy config without a pod restart, I think is what I got from it. But I don't know if there's a design doc on that.
So proxy config certificates.
Yep.
Yes, the idea when we discuss this is that since proxy config can be pushed by XDS server, we have the ability at runtime to change those fields without restarting support. So ideally, all the fields in proxy config will be pushed dynamically. So you will not have to restart the pod ever. But implementation-wise, some fields are unfortunately cannot require a restart. So that's why we kind of try to document one or the other.
Yeah, I don't know how we would do it with a field like concurrency that would require like a full Envoy restart.
We had code to restart Envoy if necessary, so it's not impossible if we want to. John, what's your take?
I feel like it's not worth restarting Envoy.
No, I agree it's not worth it, but having some fields that are dynamic and some fields that are static, because
if there's fields that can be dynamic, right now we just have what concurrency and environment variables. Those are not very dynamic.
Yeah, that's true. But the root certificates are dynamic.
Yeah, that part will stay.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. That's everything I have. Does anyone have any other comments before we move on?
Well, what John said earlier is that freeze is around the corner.
Yeah. I'm hoping to get this API change in ASAP. Just want to make sure it's lined up and it's the right change. I think it's October 14th for feature freeze, so there's some time.
Yeah, whole 2 weeks.
Okay, Steven,
This should be quick. I mostly just want to get consensus. I think I already brought it up. I just want to double check that everybody agrees on the items needed to call multi-cluster stable. The first thing I had brought up, and there was a slight bit of contention on, was that I wanted to split out the promotion so that multi-cluster didn't encompass like every version and topology, and just kind of captured like the one good install method, which will be multi-primary, and then just like the core cross-cluster service discovery feature, rather than covering our recommended path for doing Istio D-less remotes or external Istio D, the multi-network case. I just want to make sure that those things are all split out. Like I need to make enhancements PRs, but right now we don't actually have like a separate multi-network feature status as far as I'm aware of. So that's the first thing. I don't know if anyone disagrees. Cool. And then the second thing are just a few lists of items and docs. Probably the most commonly asked question is, how do I control, how do I make a service only talk inside of one cluster, or how do I make it so I'm only talking to a service in a specific other cluster if I have more than 2 clusters? And then we have several ways to do that. We have this old mesh config setting, which is just a global setting. You can always just create separate service resources that have different names in each cluster if you really want things to be completely isolated and you have control of that. And then we do now have a synthetic label that you can use in your destination role selector to control this as well. And so these are all useful, and they all have their own cases where they're better than others. And so I just want to make sure that people are actually aware they exist.
So one comment: mesh config service settings is not an option because it's a alpha API and it's part of mesh config, and it's so if we want to have an option, we can put it in proxy config maybe, but even though I don't know how to do. But maybe we should just keep fewer options, really. I mean, just destination rule label, which is needed anyway, and per service, which is part of what user can do without any.
Yeah, agreed. The mesh config option is not my favorite.
So let's cross it out if possible.
Sounds good. So that's like the biggest thing I want to cover in docs. The next most common mistake is trying to have 2 services with the same name that are very different. Like Kubernetes' position on this is that if you're doing multi-cluster, then you need your namespaces to kind of be vaguely the same. And so I want to link to their definition of sameness and kind of expand on it for any cases that Istio has. And then just highlighting troubleshooting documents, and that should be mostly it. And then the next thing would be tooling, the bug report command. Right now, we don't really tell users, and some of them get confused, that you need to actually run it separately against each cluster. It might be possible to add support to just make it automatically run against all the clusters, but we don't have that today. And then I also want to just add something to it so it actually collects a few multi-cluster specific data points. And then we have a bunch of the multi-cluster commands are sitting under like the experimental that have been around for a while. The remote clusters one's new, but it's pretty much just grabbing data from a debug endpoint. It's pretty safe. And then create remote secret has been around since like 1.5 or 1.6. So I think we can move that out of experimental. And then as far as upgrade testing goes, that is tricky. We don't really have automated upgrade tests in general as part of our integration tests outside of one Helm upgrade test. I tried to start porting that to multi-cluster, but it's kind of tricky. So what I've done so far is made it so that we actually test revision install, not cross-version revisions, but just the same revision. And I can try to, like, our test framework does have support out for everything to do with like testing multiple versions outside of the actual installation. And so I can try to do a scripted install and maybe wrap it up in a prow job, or maybe just kind of have it be a reproducible, runnable thing to prove that multi-cluster upgrades are safe.
What does upgrade really means in this context? Because in case of multi-cluster, what we need to test is that you can have different version running at the same time. So you have one cluster with version X, with the other cluster
Exactly.
with version Y. There is no upgrade. The fact that you downgrade the cluster doesn't change what happens inside.
Well, yeah, I guess a multi-version test would be a better.
Multi versions, but so basically we don't need to upgrade a cluster. We just need to have one cluster installed with, even with Canary version and primary. It's kind of the same thing.
Right now the two versions are the same, so we want to show that we have compatibility with some specific version numbers.
Absolutely. What I mean is that the test should test with two different versions, but we don't necessarily need to dynamically change the version or to do an upgrade per se.
Right. Yeah. The thing that we don't have automated is a way to install old versions.
Okay. We definitely need to do that because we need interop tests and all the cross-version upgrades. So that's bigger than multi-cluster.
Yeah, it is bigger than multi-cluster, but I remember it was somebody mentioned it as like a feature promotion requirement. If we don't have it for everything, that might be a little looser, but I at least want to get some manual test run with that. Or just manually trigger our integration tests against a setup that has the multiple versions installed.
What I mean is that if you do it, maybe you can just make it a bit more generic. That's all.
Yeah, that the install part is really tricky, especially in a way that's runnable in CI. I've talked to Sam a lot about this, and we are working on it, but there's no way I'm going to be able to do that and these other items in the 1.12 timeframe.
Okay, let's do it for multi-cluster, and then 1.13, 14, we can move further.
Something that I know works well, and I've done a lot of manual testing of, is taking a cluster that is installed without like plugin CA certs or anything like that, and then transitioning it to use plugin CA certs and then adding additional clusters. So just, but the thing that is not well tested and might have bugs is removing clusters from an existing mesh. Using the cluster local controls and the destination rule label, you're able to move traffic away from a cluster, but right now there's no way to fully remove a cluster from Pilot's view without Istio restart. It will try to purge all the services, but I've observed a couple cases where it doesn't do it correctly. And so that's my biggest concern as far as a bug that would block us from promoting.
So what's the behavior? I mean, if a cluster just disappears for some time, we lose endpoints for sure.
This is like when you intentionally want to remove that cluster, and so you would want to lose those endpoints.
More common is unintentionally one cluster goes down because there is the zone is not available. There is something happening. So the unintentional case is a subset of an unintentional case. So if we support the unintentional, then we are covered for the other one.
Right. I think we've talked about this before, and we didn't really want to couple control plane availability with data plane availability. What we ended up doing is, if informers and reachability to the APIs, the remote API server starts to fail, we have a bunch of metrics that users can monitor to know that they need to start moving traffic away from that as well. But to tie those two things together seems pretty dangerous.
No, my question is what is this? Because I think what is critical is what happens in case of an outage in one of the clusters. If we solve this problem and have a good story, then the other one is a particular.
Well, we should use locality load balancing with failover and other mechanisms to deal with this, rather than having the control plane explicitly start dropping endpoints.
But at some point, we don't we have to drop endpoints? I mean, if a cluster is is down for more than X hours or some time, don't we drop them?
Not automatically. We have a lot of alarms that allow the operator to do this themselves.
Well, when a cluster goes down, Istio probably will have to scale up, or there will be all kind of events, and it's not like we can keep them in memory forever. with the current infrastructure.
So you're saying that if the cluster A cannot, or Istio in cluster A cannot reach the Kubernetes API server in cluster B for some period of time, it should drop everything it knows about that cluster?
I'm saying that weird things will happen because Istio may restart, Istio may scale up. There are all kind of things that happen, and if a new version of new instance of Istio is started, then obviously it will not have the endpoints.
An inconsistent
And
state.
you're having an inconsistent state, and again, that's the infrastructure we have today, where we get the endpoints. If we had synchronization, like what I think Nate or someone else was working on, with endpoint slice synchronization and then persistence, then we could have a consistent approach. But that's a new feature that is probably not even close to.
Yeah, I think I actually do remember the proposal where you made a really similar comment.
I don't think it's a blocker for graduation. I mean, it's something that exists, but we should try to have a story at least.
So as far as should I add this as an item that we should document, what the current behavior is?
Yeah, find out what is the current behavior and document.
Yeah, like just an operational guide for if you're going to run multi-cluster, keep an eye on these things. I think the metrics are listed in our docs, but we don't say if you're running multi-cluster, you really need to be alerting on these.
Yeah.
Okay. And then testing is pretty good. It's been pretty good for a long time. There's a few things that have just got skipped that need to be, unskipped, or we need to find out if they're real bugs. So I'm going to look into those. And then the only real feature that we want to make sure we support better is headless services and stateful sets. Stateful sets are a little weird because you could end up with name conflicts across clusters. And right now we do have kind of partial support. The way it'll work is when there's a name conflict, it will choose the more local endpoint, but that's still not very good. And I don't really recommend people using it. But we do have a couple of users who have tried out the experimental multi-cluster headless support using the DNS proxy and DNS auto allocation. So I want to expand our testing of that, just unskip a few spots that use headless services and skip under multi-cluster. And then possibly turn that flag on by default in 112, because right now we won't share the headless endpoints across clusters.
How does it work if you have 3 replicas in cluster A and 3 replicas in cluster B, or 4 replicas in cluster B? We randomly select them, and because the whole definition of stateful set is that they are shards.
Right, which is why I don't really like the MCS version. Rather than doing -1, 2, 3, it has a first hyphen for which cluster and then a second hyphen for which instance, which works a bit better.
But does it really work? Because again, you when you deploy a stateful set in a cluster, it's it's presumably sharding the data into the 3 stateful sets, and if you the application needs to be aware of this. I mean, it's kind of something the application built in is doing the sharding. You cannot shard. You replicate across our cluster. You don't shard.
So you could switch to a different replica, and the shards should probably align 1-to-1 across each replica.
My point is not a feature that we can probably support in as stable, or because it's not well defined and we don't even know. So supporting stateful sets in one cluster only, that's okay. That's reasonable.
Yeah, I mean the comment here is pretty much to say we don't want to solve this ourselves right here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not part of the graduation. It's a feature that we delay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's perfect then.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that is pretty much it. I don't know if anybody has any major concerns. I think the most concerning one is, how do I take a cluster out of rotation if something's wrong with it? And so if I think that will be kind of the crux on whether or not we can promote.
Do we have any guidance on that right now, or do we have a way that's untested, or it's just we need to figure out even what we want to do?
So I've done a few proof of concepts where I've used the destination role label to do traffic shifting and find ways to slowly move traffic away from a cluster, but there's nothing that truly drains long-lived connections that we have. And then once that's done, you can delete the remote secret and stop watching that other cluster. And when you drain traffic like that, it seems to work pretty well. But I know recently John sent me a case where an extra remote secret that was like malformed was added and then deleted, and then the endpoints were never cleaned up. And I'm not sure if that bug is reproducible outside of a case where, like, I don't know if I can reproduce that case where the remote secret was, correct. Because essentially what had happened is there was 2 remote secrets with different cluster names, but they pointed to the same cluster. When the bad cluster name one was removed, every endpoint for every cluster was wrong. It was all pointing to just one cluster, even though there was like 4 clusters. And I haven't been able to replicate that yet. And so that's why I'm somewhat concerned about the ability to just delete a remote secret and assume everything's going to be cleaned up properly. So I think using traffic policy to shift traffic away from the cluster you're trying to take out of rotation is the better solution for now. Or at least the better first step solution before removing secrets.
How do you shift traffic away?
You have the topology label.
So do we have a not? I mean, excludes
No.
this.
Yeah, that's
why I'm asking.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Yeah, I guess that really only works if you only have 2 clusters. Otherwise, you'd be like just making everything completely cluster local.
But if it's down, it's down. I mean, if you cannot reach the nodes, then there is no need to write a traffic policy because it will be, not ready.
Yeah. So I mean, I think as like for our operational guide on here's the things you should do if you're going to bring multi-cluster to production, should we start like heavily recommending or the topology aware load balancing stuff with failover?
I'm not sure. It's complicated.
Yeah.
Probably want people to keep it simple. But let's add some testing to see what happens in the regular, the expected, unexpected, basically the outages of a cluster. If we can survive and without user intervention and everything keeps working, then I think we are good.
All right. Yeah, I think we have a few mechanisms to do that in our kind stuff. We can just like remove the IP routes and see things start to freak out. All
Yeah,
right,
in general, we need more testing for Istio for unexpected stuff because we have very little coverage of uncoverable stuff.
Agreed. Are there any other things in this doc that you think need to be added or clarified before bringing it to TOC?
So a quick question on headless. Is that only supported with flat network?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, it is only supported with flat network. We don't really have a way to make it work with multi-network right now.
And stateful set.
Yeah, and then stateful set isn't, I wouldn't really claim support for cross-cluster stateful set at all.
Okay, maybe you just mark those clear in the stock. That would be helpful.
The stateful set should work if the stateful set is in a single cluster. So it works, other cluster can call it. It's not a problem as far as I know.
Yeah, but when you start other clusters should be able to call it, but once you start having like 2 stateful sets with the same.
That two stateful set with the same name in different clusters is not supported, but stateful set in one cluster and
I mean, that's the same with headless, right? It's just you can't split out between clusters for one single service.
No, headless should work across clusters. Even if you have like 2 headless services foo in each cluster, they should be able to call each other.
But only for flat network.
Yeah, only flat network.
Okay.
Everything, both of them are flat network. I mean, everything that is that involves multi-network will require probably HBON or significant changes.
Yeah.
Because with HBON you can basically add a header that specify exact destination, and then we can effectively route to a particular IP.
I see. The other question I have, so Stephen, I think we had this discussion before. The label you were discussing, topology.istio.io/network, that label is still config at installation time, right? It's just a user use it on their destination rule and virtual service.
The slash cluster, I think you mean.
Oh, right. You could do /cluster too. And you can also do /network also, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I'm gonna try to make sure that we, maybe elevate the fact that multi-network and multi-cluster are somewhat separate features.
Oh, right. Good point.
Is
Yeah.
the one main thing, and then the other thing is, yeah, that just set with the cluster name that you use when you install the control plane.
Okay, that makes sense.
Cool. Is there anything else? All right, I think that's it for me, Sam.
Thanks, Stephen. Okay, and John, I think you got the rest of the time.
Yeah, my two were quick. One was just I have the PR in doc for the automated gateway controller stuff we've been talking about. Just need review on the PR and kind of official approval on the doc. I think it sounded like we had agreement there. We just don't have the checkbox.
It has my approval.
Yep, mine too.
Cool. The other thing was just distro list. This is we talked about this a bit in the test and release, but just wanted to bring it up here because there's some relationship. I think we're planning to ramp up on this a bit, making it more supported, adding better tooling, docs, making more tests run on it, etc. So just want to bring that up. Nothing major, just to FYI.
We still keep it as an option, not the default, no?
Yeah, so for now, it will be an option, opt-in. In the future, I think we want to move in the direction where it's a default. We'll always keep the other one as an option, I think. But that will be a wider discussion. I mean, there's a lot of implications there in terms of backwards compatibility.
And debug support, troubleshooting,
Yep.
we may have some actually that's an interesting issue. We discussed in the past of having some flags that says production versus development mode. And based on that, we can have different settings. For example, in production, we have MTLS at default. We can have distress as a default. We can have, the annotations that we discussed earlier ignored and so forth. I mean, kind of strict mode versus development mode, or however we want to call it.
Yeah. Yeah, in terms of the debugging, that's probably the biggest blocker for us ever making this default. And I know we've been burned by KEPs in the past, but I believe that they're actually going to have ephemeral containers on by default in Kubernetes 1.23. And so real users may have it in their clusters by, say, March, if they're early adopters. So it may actually finally happen. I don't have a whole lot of faith, but it is.
Now, with ephemeral containers, once ephemeral containers are broadly deployed, or if they're in a version of Kubernetes that has ephemeral containers, then yeah, we can default to distroless.
All right. Yeah, that's all I want to mention. We'll have bigger discussions in the future if we try and make it default. But for now, we're just trying to make it better. Perhaps beta, except I realized that 1.12 is way sooner than I thought. So there's very minimal chance that will happen in 1.12, but perhaps 1.13.
John, one question. You did this wonderful work with Helm uploading the to the repository. Do you think it's possible to do the same thing for the RPMs or Debian files to have repo add equivalent?
In like the official repos or like host our own custom one?
Something equivalent where we don't tell people to curl some unsigned files from the internet.
Yeah, I don't know what it's like to host like our own thing. I'm not as you're probably more familiar than I am with the stuff, but from my understanding, it's very hard to get into like the official repos. So
No, but it is possible in Ubuntu. It's possible to create a private.
Right. Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, I think we could probably do that. I don't know how much work it entails, but
okay.
Yeah.
Maybe test and release. We can move it there.
Yeah, I mean, if someone wanted to do that, that sounds good. Yeah.
If only we knew someone in Red Hat that could help.
Well, we can keep dreaming. All right, I have to go. See you guys.
Okay, see you.
All right, thanks everyone.
Bye.